You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 57. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. We've decided not to have a sponsor for the podcast, but if you want to support the podcast and the kinds of things I do, feel free to visit my Pluralsight courses at seanw.me/psauthor, including my newest course on building a web app with ASP.NET 5. Starting this February, we're going on a road trip covering 25 cities in North America and Europe. We'll be doing live interviews of some of your favorite developers, including Scott Guthrie, Tim Huckabee, and Julie Yack. See hwroadtrip.com for more information on cities and dates. On today's show, we have Billy Hollis. For any of you who already know of Billy Hollis, you know he's a passionate guy around UX. Billy is internationally known for his work on user experience design and native software development. His team based in Nashville, Tennessee has created modern apps hailed around the world for innovation and effective use of advanced user interface techniques. Billy offers training on user experience design for any platform and technical classes on XAML technologies, including the Universal Windows Platform. You can see Billy at major conferences all around the world, usually doing sessions to help developers become more focused on designing and developing software that users love. On today's show, Billy talks about that passion and how that transformed from his early days in writing software to starting to understand that the design of each piece of software is really important to the end users. We talk with Billy about not only how he got started, but how that matured into this space where he's user-focused in almost everything he does. Let's take a listen. I've been looking forward to this talk for quite a while. I've got the esteemed Billy Hollis on the show today. How are you doing, Billy?
I'm doing fine. You're the first person who's used esteemed, I think.
I think the audience knows that to be true. Yeah, I've known about you for years and years and years, and I think of you as sort of the developer's design guy, the person who really cares about the user experience and has been in the XAML space for forever. Do I have that right?
That's pretty much right, but it even goes back further than that, really. I have never enjoyed the coding aspect of software development as much as most of our colleagues have.
Sure.
So I've always found myself on the edges of the software development process, and one of those has traditionally been to see if I can talk to users and find out what they want and figure out ways to give them what they want. I have a higher level of interest, I find, in that than let's say 95, 98% of developers. And my interest in XAML basically came out of that because it is such a wonderful technology for giving users what they want that I have been very, very happy to be spending most of my time developing in that over the last, about 8 years now.
Oh, wow. So when you were a kid, is this something that, the computers themselves, is this something that you started with? Did you have a computer at the house as a kid, or was this something that happened in school?
Sean, do you realize how old I am?
I wasn't going to even guess.
Well, let's just put it this way. When I graduated high school in 1973, there was not a computer in my high school. The most complex device there was a Selectric typewriter.
Well, that's
the first computer. So if you understand how far back I go, was there a computer in my house? Well, no, because it would have cost $100,000 to put one there.
That's a point.
So I was lucky enough when I started college at the University of Tennessee to learn Fortran in my freshman year.
Sure.
That was the first year that the freshman 3/4 of physics used computers to analyze the data that we generated during experiments.
Wow.
So they spent the first quarter teaching us Fortran. and then the other 2 quarters doing experiments and analyzing them. So I learned Fortran on punch cards in 1973, learned BASIC on a DEC 10, my first terminal-based language in 1975, and started coding mini computers and microcomputers for money in 1978.
Wow. So I don't know if you've heard, but NASA is looking for Fortran programmers.
Are they really?
Yes, they are.
I really don't know if I could go back and extract that expertise, because once I found BASIC, it became kind of my personal buddy in the computer world. I still do most of my demos in Visual Basic even to this day. I'll write in C# for clients when they need me to, but when I'm writing for my own purposes, I'm writing it in Visual Basic.
And so this was BASIC the first language you really fell in love with, as, sort of a way to describe?
I don't know about fall in love, because that implies an emotional connection to computer languages that I don't really know that I've ever had. But technology to me has always been a tool to solve some very, very interesting problems. And I found BASIC to be by far the most useful tool during most of my career. In the 1980s, BASIC was the most flexible language for programming the DOS-based platforms of that decade. In the 1990s, Visual Basic was the most effective platform for programming the GUI-based applications that we wrote then. And so after that long a time of becoming, it just comes off my fingertips, Sean. That's
Sure.
when I sit down when I think about a problem, that's the language with which I express it. And I spend, I think, a lot more time thinking about problems before I sit down at a keyboard to code than most people. So I don't know that it's really an emotional connection. It's much more so that I just find it to be by far the most useful thing in my language toolbox.
That's interesting. So when you started coding or I should say, designing and building systems in, I think you said 1978, what were those systems like?
Well, those systems were mostly time-sharing systems, so that there would be one system sharing. The main system I worked on would go up to 8 or 10 users. And it was actually pretty advanced for the day. That was 1978. I would guess it was probably 1987 or 88 before the DOS-based technologies from Microsoft for languages caught up with what that platform would do. My main client at that time was TVA, and I was doing programming to help their executives manage things like to-do lists and calendars and such. We take that for granted that every platform has that now, but the platforms at the time did not, especially for time-sharing things. Time-sharing things had not reached the point where executives or their secretaries tended to have them on their desks. So we were just moving into that era. And so that's some of the first stuff I did was on those mini computers. But when I transitioned to PCs in the early 80s, that was by far a platform I felt was a lot more broadly applicable to solving problems. So I've spent my time in that part of the technology world continuously since then.
And did your method of sort of helping solve these problems, did that formulate itself pretty early on these early projects? Or is this idea of, your ability to discern what people want, to be able to talk to them and extrapolate how to solve the problem, did this formulate itself early, or is this something that happened later?
I think a certain very core kernel idea of it developed pretty early, but there's no questioning that it really developed a lot over the years. The big transition was in the early 90s when I went from pretty much doing everything on my own to being part of a bigger team. But yes, I think from the very earliest days of doing things, sitting down with users and understanding what they wanted and coming up with, I think the thing that I tend to do, Sean, that most people don't, did start pretty early. And that is, let's find multiple potential ideas that solve a given problem. Because I know that I don't understand the user's job at the level of detail, that I have confidence that I can come up with the right way to do it the first time I come up with a way. So where I think most developers understand that, but their approach is to come up with a way of doing it and then to take it to the user and say, what do you like and what do you not like? From almost the earliest times that I developed software, I would try to come up with multiple ways to do things and let people help me evaluate which of those approaches was closest to what the user needed. And I've been more aggressive about doing that as we've moved into the XAML world, because we got a lot more possibilities, don't we?
Sure.
In that world. But even in the DOS world and in the Visual Basic world, the first book I wrote about Visual Basic development and design in 1999 showed some examples from the mid-90s where I had come up with 3 different ways of accomplishing a particular user interface task. So that idea of multiple ways of exploring multiple ways of doing things was a pretty early part of what I did. But very early on, I really didn't have a process. I just kind of felt my way through it. And I didn't really have any understanding of what was likely to work or not, except at an intuitive level.
Sure.
And the development over time was to read a lot about design. I read my first design-oriented book in 1987, Donald Norman's The Psychology of Everyday Things, which they changed the title on that to The Design of Everyday Things, because I don't think the title really told people that it was a design book. So I started reading that and read various books during the 1990s, and I probably read an aggregate 70, maybe 80 design books over the years. And I've tried to glean from that better ways of doing things. And at this point, when I walk into a client, I've got a process in place. I've got pretty much my entire process. I teach classes on it, on this is what you do to understand the problem better. And this is what you do to develop the ideas of how you're going to attack the problem. So I've got a process to go through that stuff now. And I wouldn't say that it's prescriptive, because things just vary too much in the overall ecosystem of our industry.
Sure.
So you have to be prepared to be flexible, but I've got kind of a framework of a process that I use these days. And that's gotten, I'd say, fairly mature in the last 5 or 6 years.
That's great. That's great. If we go back, you talked about starting to work in 1978, but you were in college, I assume, before that?
I was. In 1978, I was still in graduate school.
And did you expect that this was going to be the career? Was your degree in computer science?
No, it wasn't. There was no computer science degree for most of my undergraduate time. My degree was in math, and I did take computer science courses because I thought they would be useful. But the computer science degree was introduced when I was very close to graduation.
Interesting.
So there was no need for me to do that. So no, I didn't really expect this to be a career. Actually, I got out of college not having a clue what I was going to do, because I'm more of a generalist. That's one of the reasons I think design fits me very well.
Sure.
Design is a discipline in which you really need to be a generalist. You need the technology understanding and the soft skills understanding, et cetera. So I came out of college really not knowing what I was going to do. I took the medical college admissions test just on a lark and scored so high on it that I got into medical school.
Oh, really?
And dropped out after a year because it really didn't hold any interest for me. It really wasn't right for me, but it was just something that I tried. And then I went back to graduate school, again, not really knowing what I would do. But then in the late 70s and early 80s, the industry hit that point where computers were just expanding into every niche of our economy. And the demand for people who could make them do things to solve real problems, that demand has outstripped the supply as long as I've been in this business, Sean. It still does today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I fell into the business. And I think for that reason, I don't really have the same mindset as a lot of people who consciously chose it and decided, because in the junior high, they had a Commodore 64 or something, and decided that was going to be their life. I never really chose it. It's just been, I love solving problems. And if I were in a different venue in which I could solve problems, I could leave software behind. But for this day and age, this is the ripest, most opportunistic area in which we can solve interesting problems, because that's what I like to do.
That's great. That's great. So when you started working, you implied earlier that you worked, as the one guy working on a project until much later. What was that like? Did you have any other people that you could bounce it off? Was the beginning community starting, or what? No, do you remember your CompuServe number?
I did have a CompuServe ID, but there was very little help on, especially the earliest technologies I worked on, because the platform that I was using to develop that TVA software I talked about earlier, there were probably no more than 3 or 4 people in Tennessee who knew how to program that particular system.
Wow.
So basically, I learned how to use it because I worked for a company that decided to distribute it. The president of the company walked in one day and put a big stack of manuals on my desk and said, as far as this system goes, you are God. Here you go. And I had to teach myself everything about that system out of those manuals. And as a consequence, yeah, some things went slower than they should have. And I had to rely pretty much on my own devices. I remember, for example, solving a programming problem in what I thought was a pretty clever way. And probably 6 or 8 years later, I outlined it to someone. And the guy said, yes, well, you invented a linked list. Because I didn't know what a linked list was, but I kind of invented the concept independently. It wasn't until the late 80s that I really began to have enough people around in the PC arena that I really had a community of people that I could bounce ideas off of and work with. And then that took another step up in the mid 90s when I began working on a team to develop more complex applications.
And what was that transition like? Because, team dynamics versus being the guy are two very different sort of muscles to flex.
They are, but it was, from my perspective, a great transition because there are types of problems you can solve with a team you can't solve just by yourself because of time constraints, if nothing else. But in addition to that, it also happened to come about at the exact time that the Visual Basic community was switching to the earliest kind of object-oriented thinking that they did. Visual Basic 4 didn't add complete object capabilities, but added enough that you could begin thinking about them in those terms. And I was very fortunate. The first team that I was on had a very, very smart guy. His name was Eric Martin. Eric, unfortunately, died of brain cancer.
Oh, wow.
A few years after that, which was just a loss to the Nashville community because he was quite brilliant. He came out of the C++ world and had done a little small talk and understood the object-oriented space very well. And that, plus some of the early books on the subject, Deborah Carrata had one of the great books on the subject at that time, helped me move into object-oriented thinking. And so it was both teams and objects coming up at the same time. The people that I worked on that first team with have just completely influenced everything I've done since then. One of the guys on that team is my business partner today.
Oh, great.
20 years later.
Wow.
And he and I just I don't know what we do without each other. Another person on that team went to work for Microsoft in 1998, has since moved to Redmond and is very high up in the Office 365 bureaucracy there. He's one of the I don't know what his title is, but he's been around a long time and he's one of the senior guys there. So that team really helped me. I think I probably would have gotten bored with the industry within a few years if I'd had to do everything by myself and gone and found something else. But the vibrancy of having all those people and all that new technology and all the new ways of thinking, especially as we moved into the .NET era, just was what really fueled my ability to build a real career out of this. Understand something, Sean. In 1995, I was 40 years old. And at that point, I didn't have any reputation of any consequence outside Nashville, Tennessee, and not that much reputation there.
Right.
I was just kind of going along. I guess I was probably a little higher paid than most developers, but I didn't really have anything that I could look at and say, boy, that's a really successful career thing that you've done there, Billy. But in the mid-90s, I began doing a lot of writing, and the advent of the internet then allowed that information about me and the content that I produced to go to a much, much wider audience. And then I rode the .NET wave to more notoriety, because when I looked at it, I said, this is what solves all the problems that classic VB does not solve.
So this transition to the team, it's something I'm really fascinated by, because I sort of went through this process myself. Was there an emotional piece of whether you were afraid to sort of join a big team and give up sort of the having to be the superhero for the little companies you were working with? Or was it something you were just excited to try?
No, I was excited just because we could do things that we couldn't do before. And I didn't feel that I've never really felt a strong need to just kind of control everything. So I didn't get a lot of thrill out of being the essential man, the irreplaceable person. In fact, I'm almost at the other end of the scale. I would rather do something and then be able to hand it off to someone and then go on and do something new and exciting. And that's really hard to do if you're the one guy.
It's true. It's true.
Because people are depending on you. And I have a pretty strong sense of obligation if people expect, if they build a business around some stuff that I give them, and I'm the only person who really can help them, then I feel an obligation to do that. I wrote a system for utility billing in 1987 because I tried a little venture with a partner who thought that was a good idea to sell a package we didn't have. So I wrote it and they used it. I took some DOS-based computers into this office up in Tennessee Ridge, Tennessee. These young ladies had never seen a computer in their lives until I put one on their desk with this software. Well, they continued to use me to keep things going until they got a new program in 1999 for Y2K.
Wow.
In the interim, I had become pretty well known and written books and such. But if those young ladies called me up, I felt like I can't let them down. What are they going to do? So this idea of going to a team meant that I could get that responsibility spread out, that there would be people that I left behind when I went on to something new that would understand what I did and be able to take care of it, and that I wouldn't be letting anybody down by going on to a new and challenging problem. So to me, that was one of the major advantages of being in a team, besides the fact that there were just a whole lot more people to learn from.
Sure, absolutely. And the community in Nashville was growing at that point?
It was just taking root at that point. I think the first user group meetings that I recall were in about 1996 or 1997. And that was just as the Microsoft community began to build enough so that there were enough of us to talk to each other and enough people to produce content. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to produce a nice presentation for 3 people, really. You would just go have a chat with them. But we started to see user groups that would have 15 and 20 people there. And that's when I started doing the speaking in the community, was at that user group. Now, I've been in public speaking since I was in 2nd grade. So that really wasn't something that I had to develop as I moved into the industry. But that was the point at which I began speaking specifically to developers about software-related topics.
And is that, I know you've written the books and you speak at a lot of conferences. Is that part of the joy of what you're doing?
Yes. I'm at the point, Sean, where I don't know that I would really need necessarily to go to the conferences to continue to get enough business to do what I want to do. I get enough calls that I have to turn down that it would be probably years before I ran out of things to do if I didn't go to the conferences anymore. But I like getting on that stage. I enjoy it. I get a thrill out of it. I still find new things that it seems that nobody else seems to have stumbled across to show my audiences. In many cases, that's because my team is facing real world problems. We're going out and writing pretty complex applications with, in many cases, fairly complex needs for the user. So we're discovering some new things, and I get the joy of presenting these things to people. And I'm still excited about that. I'm still just as excited about that as I was when I first started speaking at conferences in the late 90s. So I do it because I really like it. And I have great relationships with a lot of the conference people too. I don't really do it for the money or anything like that, because I've got other ways of making money. But I still get a thrill out of taking those steps up on the stage to show people something that they've never seen before.
That's great. And if you were looking back at your career, would you change anything about how it's progressed? Decisions, platforms you didn't jump on, or anything like that?
Now, that's an interesting question, and I have to think about that a moment. I have made some good guesses. I'd like to think they were informed guesses. But for example, there was the Power Builder versus Visual Basic decision in the 93 timeframe. Mm-hmm. And I looked at both and decided that Power Builder was not going to be the long-term stable platform that I wanted to invest in, that Visual Basic would work. And that turned out, of course, to be correct. I looked at Java in 1997, 98. And found it to be very interesting and have a lot of innovations in it, but it didn't solve the problems I needed it to solve. And then .NET came along and stole all the best ideas from Java and added some more. So that was the platform that I felt would work. I I really have personally and for my clients gotten a lot of enjoyment out of the XAML world. It did not have the success that I thought it would. I was hopeful that at that time we would see the kind of expertise develop that would allow really, really innovative solutions to problems. Because from my perspective, at that point, let's call it 2008, 2009, we had been stuck in the same basic paradigms for how we interacted with users since roughly 1993, 15 years.
Yeah.
And I thought it was time to break out. But we really didn't break out until Apple came along with iOS and really used capabilities for design far beyond what I would ever be able to apply to transition the entire world. But my team has done, I think, some very, very innovative things in the XAML space. And I thought that we would just be one of many doing a lot of those things. And in fact, I have been disappointed to see that has not done as well as I had hoped it would. Perhaps the Universal Apps platform will be the impetus to make some of that work. It's a great platform. But that's the one area where I've personally had a fair amount of success, but I don't think that the platform did as well as I hoped it would when it started.
Sure, and I can see that. I mean, coming from the Silverlight space and all that, you can certainly see that happening. What I find interesting is sort of the reluctance of clients to dive into sort of new paradigms of UI. And I know you've talked about this a lot. I still find a lot of clients that are like, but all we need is a grid, this sort of grid-based development that's happening. And do you see that corporate clients are sort of finally moving away from that now that they've got, this powerful computer in their pocket that's not just a grid of data that they want to edit?
There is some movement away from it. There's no doubt. We are seeing demand for a better way of doing things in most cases because people do know that there are better alternatives. But particularly when it comes to data grids, it's very difficult for many of our current decision-making generation to visualize a better way of doing things. And so they think it's good enough, and they don't really see that the investment is warranted to make it significantly better, because design is an investment. It's like any other investment in what goes on in business. People don't develop software just to give us jobs. They develop software to make money. And if they don't see a return on that investment, and in many cases they can't visualize it because of their own sort of the rut they're stuck in, then they won't invest money in it. They don't see that it's important. But there are more visionary people. But I think we're kind of in the same situation in some respects as medicine in the following aspects. I've known this for a long time. This was taught to me when I was in medical school, is that new techniques in medicine take a long time to really penetrate throughout the entire industry. It's commonly said that in order for things to really change, a generation or two of doctors have to die off and let new ones come in that don't have the connection to the old way of doing things. I think things are more accelerated in our industry than medicine, but there is certainly some of that effect is still in play, that we have a generation of decision makers. You think about the people who are in, let's say, their late 40s now, who are most of the decision makers in our industry. Mm-hmm. What kind of technologies did they come up with? What kind of technologies do they feel comfortable understanding and applying? Well, that's mostly the GUI-based technologies that came about in the 90s. So they don't really, they may know intellectually that there are alternatives, but they don't have enough connection to those alternatives, and they have too much connection to the older the older technologies that design people would call the status quo bias. They're just biased in favor of the stuff that they understand, and they don't necessarily see the return on the new stuff, so that they don't really understand that they're losing their company's money in many cases. Because better ways of doing things, we've seen this one with our own client situations, we save people a lot of money by giving them a better user experience. But it takes work. It takes kind of getting loose from the past, and it takes a process of understanding what the user does that is more in depth than developers are accustomed to today. So we see the demand for it increasing pretty regularly, and I think that demand will continue to increase as the decision-making group turns over into people with more experience in more modern technologies and applications. But I don't see a headlong rush into better UX. There's plenty to keep folks like us busy, but the industry still is mired in 1990s era thinking about a lot of the stuff we put in front of users.
Sure. And that makes a lot of sense. I used to talk about the blue button problem where you talk to the stakeholders and they get focused on the little things that don't matter, like the color of the buttons, instead of those real problems of working through the actual UI. Is it going to be faster or easier, whatever the goals of the project are to solve the problem. But because they can focus on these little minutiae, that sometimes they get caught up in it because they're just they just have more confidence in the little things than the really big problems.
Yeah, they think the visual stuff it equates to good design, and it really doesn't.
Yeah.
What's good design has much more to do with the interaction patterns that you put in front of the users. And to them, an interaction pattern is just moving around inside the cells of a grid, and they don't understand that there are alternatives. But I have seen, though, that even as long as there's one visionary in a company that understands that things could be done better, and they bring somebody in that shows some of the alternatives. See, they won't really believe that you can do a lot better until you put something in front of them that is. But at that point, the ability for people to lose their connection to the past and make that leap forward, I've seen to be a lot easier than I thought it would be. I've seen people who just insisted that we couldn't do anything better than their data grids. And then 6 months later, they've seen a design that is much better, and they've completely lost that connection that they had to this 15-year-old way of thinking about things. So yeah, that nobody in this industry, particularly decision makers, want to be seen as out of touch. Everybody has their own self-interest, and it doesn't make sense for them to just throw open to people like me the ability to affect whether or not they succeed in their businesses. Right. They feel uncomfortable with this new area, this new landscape of UI. So it's very natural for them to retreat back into the comfort zone so a large part of what we do when we go into these folks is to help them understand, number one, and I've told my partner this many times over the years, we're not really selling innovation as much as we're selling low risk. That we will find a better way of doing things, and it won't risk your business. It won't be so expensive, et cetera. So a lot, and people that are going to try to work more in the innovative UX space need to take this to heart. Those people that you're trying to convince to go down this path have got to be convinced that, number one, it's not risky, and number two, there's a return at the end of it. If you can't do that, then they probably aren't going to bite. Just showing them fancy visual stuff is not going to get them motivated enough. I mean, they think that, as you said, they think they can probably do some of that themselves, that they're just as good as anybody else at judging that. They're not really, but they think they are. But when it comes to interaction design, I've never really run into anybody in the decision-making space, or mostly in the developer space, who feel like they understand enough to come up with that on their own. They can criticize based on their own understanding of the job flow, but that tends to be a critiquing, a good back and forth, a refinement process, rather than getting into minutia that doesn't really matter.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, this has been really good for me. I'm hoping for my listeners as well. A great conversation about, just the power of design, and it's interesting because we're not that different in age, but just enough that how we got started was a little different. And I appreciate you being on the show. Hope you had a good time.
I'm happy to do it, and it does surprise me that there are people out there that are just starting to think about this because of their own transitions, and nobody wants to feel out of touch, Sean. And we're getting to the point where I'm hoping to have a HoloLens in my possession within a few months.
Awesome.
And this is just a completely new world. People don't need to be getting stuck in the old way of thinking about software to stay relevant as our industry goes through these changes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World Podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to the Hello World Podcast at hwpodcast.com.